For centuries, Britain and France fought for control of Europe, the seas, and eventually much of the world. Both built huge empires. Both won great wars. Both suffered major defeats. And both came surprisingly close to becoming the most powerful nation on Earth. But if you had to choose just one, Britain or France, who actually won? To find out, we have to go back to the beginning of their rivalry. Alright, so, before we talk about Britain versus France, we need to go way back. Because honestly, these two countries did not just wake up one day and decide to hate each other. Their rivalry took hundreds of years to build. And the funny thing is, neither Britain nor France looked anything like the countries we know today. The borders were different. The people were different. Even the languages were still changing. So let's start at the beginning. Britain before England. Okay, so, when we say Britain, we have to be careful. There was no country called Britain in the modern sense. The island was home to many different groups. The people living there were mostly Celtic-speaking tribes. They had their own leaders, their own lands, and their own local fights. There was no single British king ruling everyone. Then Rome showed up. And yeah, this changed everything. The Roman army invaded Britain in AD 43 during the rule of Emperor Claudius. Rome wanted the island for several reasons. Britain had farmland. It had natural resources. It had valuable metals. And more importantly, Rome wanted to show that it could conquer another distant land. The invasion was not easy. Roman soldiers had to fight local tribes. Some tribes joined Rome. Others fought back. One of the most famous people from this time was Boudica. She was the queen of the Iceni people. After the Romans treated her family and people badly, she led a huge revolt. Her army attacked Roman towns. London was attacked. Other Roman settlements were burned. For a short time, Rome looked like it might lose control. But the Romans fought back. Boudica's army was defeated. Rome stayed in Britain for hundreds of years. And that left a huge mark on the island. Roads were built. Towns grew. Forts appeared. Roman law and government spread. Cities such as Londinium became important. That city would eventually become London. Pretty wild when you think about it. The future capital of Britain began as a Roman city. But Rome could not stay forever. By the early 5th century, Roman power in Britain was falling apart. Rome had bigger problems across its empire. Armies were needed elsewhere. Money was running out. Enemies were attacking Roman lands. So Roman soldiers slowly left Britain. And once they were gone, Britain entered a very different world. That is where things get really interesting. The Anglo-Saxons arrive. Alright, so, after Roman rule faded, Britain became divided again. Different local rulers fought for power. Then groups from northern Europe began arriving. These included the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They settled in different parts of Britain. Over time, their languages and cultures became very important. The word England itself came from the Angles. And the English language grew from the languages these people brought with them. But Britain was still not one country. There were several kingdoms. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, and others. These kingdoms fought each other. They made deals. They broke those deals. Kings rose. Kings fell. And then another group arrived. The Vikings. Yeah, things were about to get even crazier. Viking armies attacked parts of Britain from the late 8th century onward. They came by sea. They attacked towns and monasteries. Some settled permanently. Eventually, large parts of England came under Viking control. This area became known as the Danelaw. But one kingdom became especially important. Wessex. Its king was Alfred the Great. Alfred fought the Vikings and managed to hold on to his kingdom. He also helped build stronger defenses. Over time, his successors pushed the Vikings back. England slowly became more united. And by the 10th century, the idea of one English kingdom was becoming real. But England still had a big problem. Who should rule it? That question would lead directly to one of the most famous moments in English history. The year was 1066. The Norman Conquest. Okay, so, in 1066, King Edward the Confessor died. He had no clear son to take the throne. That created a huge fight. Several people believed they had a claim. One of them was Harold Godwin's son. He became king. But across the English Channel, another man was watching. William, Duke of Normandy. And this is where France enters the story. William claimed that Edward had promised him the English crown. Harold disagreed. So William decided to take it by force. He gathered an army. He built ships. Then he crossed the English Channel. And landed in England. Harold had just fought another enemy in the north. Now he had to rush south. His army met William's army near Hastings. The Battle of Hastings became one of the most important battles in English history. Harold's army fought hard. But William eventually won. Harold was killed. William became King of England. And just like that, England was ruled by a man from Normandy. This was a massive turning point. Because Normandy was in what is now France. William was now King of England. But he still had lands in France. And that created a strange situation. Think about it. The King of England also controlled land in France. So the English king was technically a ruler inside the French world. That sounds confusing. And honestly, it was. But this strange setup would cause problems for centuries. England and Normandy. Look, this is one of the most important things to understand. The English kings were not simply enemies of France at first. They were deeply connected to France. The Norman rulers spoke French. Their nobles spoke French. Their courts used French. The English language itself changed because of this. Thousands of French words eventually entered English. Words connected to government, law, food, war, and power were influenced by French. So when people today joke about English being a mix of languages, there is a huge reason for that. The Norman conquest changed the English elite. William also built castles across England. The Tower of London is one famous example. These castles were not just pretty buildings. They were meant to control the land. They showed people who was in charge. And they helped the new Norman rulers hold on to England. But William still had a major problem. He was King of England. Yet he also had to answer to the French king for his lands in Normandy. That meant the English king could be extremely powerful. But inside France, he was also a vassal of the French king. Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for trouble. And it was. The French kingdom grows. Alright, so, while England was changing under Norman rule, France was also changing. The French king was not as powerful as people sometimes imagine. France was not one tightly controlled country. Large areas were controlled by powerful nobles. The king had to deal with dukes and counts who had their own armies, castles, and money. One of the strongest regions was Normandy. And the English kings controlled it. But France had its own royal dynasty. The Capetian kings. They slowly increased their power. They took more land. They made better deals. They built stronger government systems. And little by little, the French king became more powerful. This created a major problem. The English king had huge lands inside France. The French king wanted those lands back. So the relationship between the two kingdoms became more tense. At first, this was mostly about land and power. But over time, it became something much bigger. It became a struggle over who would dominate Western Europe. And that fight was only getting started. Henry II changes everything. Okay, so, now we get to one of the biggest English kings of the Middle Ages. Henry II. He became King of England in 1154. And his lands were enormous. He controlled England. He controlled Normandy. He controlled Anjou. He controlled large parts of what is now France. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was also incredibly important. She controlled Aquitaine, one of the richest regions in Europe. So Henry II and Eleanor had a huge collection of lands. And that made the English king one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. But here is the strange part. A huge part of the English king's power was actually located in France. Not England. That meant English and French rulers were becoming competitors over French land. The French king could not ignore that forever. The French kings wanted to bring those lands under their own control. The English kings wanted to keep them. And that basic problem would repeat again and again. Different kings. Different wars. Same fight. Who gets the land? Richard the Lionheart. Real talk, Richard I is one of the most famous English kings ever. You probably know him as Richard the Lionheart. He became king in 1189. But Richard spent very little time in England. He was much more interested in war and military campaigns. He became famous during the Crusades. He fought against Muslim armies in the Holy Land. But Richard also had another enemy closer to home. The French king. Richard and King Philip II of France had a complicated relationship. Sometimes they worked together. Sometimes they fought each other. Sometimes they were allies against another enemy. Then they turned on each other again. That was medieval politics. Nothing was simple. Richard was a powerful warrior. But he died in 1199 after being wounded during a siege in France. His death changed everything. His brother John became king. And John would have a much harder time holding on to England's lands in France. King John loses Normandy. Alright, so, King John is one of those rulers people remember for all the wrong reasons. He had serious problems. The French King Philip II attacked John's lands in France. John failed to stop him. One by one, English-controlled territories were taken. Normandy fell to the French. And this was a huge loss. Remember how William the Conqueror came from Normandy? Remember how the English kings had controlled huge lands there? Now those lands were being taken by France. By 1204, Normandy was largely under French control. That changed the balance of power. England still had lands in France. But the French king was becoming stronger. And the English king was losing ground. This would lead to even more fighting. But there was another major problem. King John was also having trouble with his own nobles. They forced him to accept Magna Carta in 1215. Magna Carta became famous because it placed limits on royal power. At the time, it was mainly about the rights of powerful nobles. But over centuries, it became an important symbol of the idea that even a king had to follow rules. So while England was losing land in France, its own political system was also changing. That would matter later. A lot. France becomes stronger. Okay, so, during the 1200s, France kept growing stronger. French kings gained more control over their kingdom. Their armies improved. Their government became more organized. Paris grew in importance. French power was spreading. England was still powerful. But the balance was changing. The French king no longer looked like a weak ruler surrounded by powerful nobles. France was becoming a real kingdom with a stronger central government. And that meant England had to take France more seriously. The two kingdoms were now direct competitors. And their rivalry was about to explode. The road to the 100 Years' War. Look, the biggest early reason for the long English-French struggle was land. English kings still controlled territories in France. French kings wanted them. But then another issue appeared. The French royal family had a succession problem. King Charles IV of France died in 1328 without a surviving son. That created a question. Who should become the next French king? Edward III of England believed he had a claim through his mother. He was the grandson of a French king. The French nobles chose Philip of Valois instead. He became Philip VI. Edward did not accept the situation forever. And this dispute helped lead to one of the longest and most famous wars in European history. The 100 Years' War. And yeah, the name is actually a little misleading. It was not one non-stop war lasting exactly 100 years. It was a series of wars and fighting that lasted from 1337 to 1453, with long breaks in between. But the struggle was real. England and France would fight for generations. And this time, the stakes were much bigger. England invades France. Alright, so, Edward III decided to challenge France. He claimed the French crown. Then he went to war. English armies crossed the Channel. They attacked French territory. And early on, England had some shocking victories. One of the most famous was the Battle of Crécy in 1346. The English army was smaller. But English longbowmen played a major role. The French knights attacked again and again. The English defenses held. The French suffered a major defeat. Then came another huge English victory. Poitiers in 1356. The English captured the French king, John II. Imagine that. The King of France was captured by the English. That was a massive blow. England looked incredibly powerful. But France was not finished. Not even close. France fights back. So here is the thing. France had something England did not. A much larger population. More land. More people. More resources. France could lose battles and still keep fighting. And over time, French kings learned from their mistakes. They avoided giving England easy battles. They used smaller attacks. They targeted English supply lines. They slowly took back territory. The war became a long struggle. England could win major battles. But winning battles was not the same as controlling France. That difference is huge. And eventually, England's position became harder to maintain. Joan of Arc. Okay, so, then comes one of the most famous people in French history. Joan of Arc. She was a young French woman from a small village. She believed she had been called to help France. France was in serious trouble. The English and their allies controlled large parts of northern France. Joan traveled to the French court. She convinced Charles, the future king, to let her help. Then she went to Orleans. The city had been under English pressure. Joan helped inspire the French side. French forces broke the English siege. And suddenly, French confidence grew. Joan became a symbol. She was captured by enemies of the French. She was handed over to an English-aligned court. She was tried and executed in 1431. She was only 19. But her story did not die with her. Her image became part of French national history. And France kept fighting. By 1453, the English had lost almost all their lands in France. Calais remained under English control for much longer. But the huge English dream of controlling France was over. France had survived. And it had become stronger. The first great phase of the rivalry had ended. But the rivalry itself was nowhere near finished. What this first era really means. Alright, so let's step back for a second. At this point, Britain and France were not yet the global rivals we think about today. There was no British Empire dominating the oceans. There was no France under Napoleon. There was no United States changing the balance of power. This was the beginning. And the biggest lesson is simple. England and France became rivals because their rulers were tied together by land, family, and power. English kings owned huge territories in France. French kings wanted those territories back. Then both sides developed stronger governments and armies. And the fight became bigger. The 100 Years' War showed something important. England could beat France in individual battles. But France had the size and resources to survive. And that difference eventually mattered. France came out of the war stronger. England turned its attention more toward its own island and internal politics. But do not let that fool you. The rivalry was not over. It was just changing. The next time these two powers would fight on a huge scale, the battlefield would not just be France. It would be the oceans. The Americas. Africa. India. And eventually, almost the entire world. That is where Britain versus France becomes a completely different story. And honestly, in the end, is when things Britain get really wild. France didn't just fight each other. Their rivalry helped shape the modern world. France dominated battlefields. Britain dominated the seas. France gave Europe Napoleon. Britain built one of history's largest global empires. So if we have to choose one winner, Britain takes the crown. But the real story is that neither country became powerful alone. Their rivalry pushed both to become stronger, and its effects can still be seen around the world today. If you enjoy history told like a story, subscribe to Natioryx.